So today we're talking about accessibility in the digital space. What does it mean, why it's important, and how do we do it? Well, the word accessible might mean different things to different people, but over time the disabled world has come to use the term to describe something that disabled people can readily use with much the same equity and dignity as other people. So when we say something is or isn't accessible, we're really making a judgment on behalf of, the general disability population rather than on the basis of someone's individual experience. And sometimes it seems to me that people who are new to accessibility find this a bit confusing. They might say, well, Joe's blind and he can use my website, so it must be accessible. But it doesn't work like that. And by the same token, if your website does comply with those guidelines, those accessibility guidelines we've been talking about, that doesn't mean that all disabled people can use it. Someone might complain to you that, your website's not accessible, when in fact it might be accessible, but there's some other reason why it isn't working for that individual. And in the end, what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop those practices that ensure that as many people as possible can use today's technology, including disabled people, even if we can't make it perfect for everyone. But why should we bother? Why should we try to make today's technology accessible for all? Well, some people may say it makes sense commercially, and Tim was talking about that. 1 in 4 people live with some sort of disability, and so that's a big market that you could be missing out on. And others do offer that morally based argument, that sort of humanity-based argument that says, websites are really empowering, technology is really empowering disabled people to finally be able to have the same access to information as everybody else. So therefore, it's a good idea for websites to be accessible. And some might just say that, in the 21st century, for God's sake, it's just the right thing to do. But in reality, neither commercially nor morally based reasons might stack up. There might be a reason why they don't stack up for the person who is actually paying the bill. So there is another reason, and Tim hinted at it, and it's possibly a very important reason. Most of today's apps and websites are there to provide some sort of service to the public. Even those that are free are perhaps doing that. So if you are the ultimately responsible, as soon as it can be said that you are providing goods or services to the public, and that's a pretty big concept, then legally you are required to at least make all reasonable efforts to ensure that your goods and services can be used by disabled people. Now, in New Zealand, we don't have specific disability legislation, but it might be coming soon because the government has committed to that in some ways. But still, we do have the Human Rights Act, and although I am very much simplifying it, that's basically what it says. You're legally obliged to make reasonable efforts to ensure that disabled people can use your goods and services, can access your goods and services. Now, people really do need to be aware of their legal obligations, and that maybe applies, a lot when you're in business. And I think right now it falls to the technology developers to gain an understanding of this obligation, because the client, that's the person actually paying the bill, that person is relying on you to deliver technology so it is fit for purpose, so it does meet the client's legal obligations. So that's why I say that that's another reason why developers need to be aware of this. It's a little bit like architects, people building public buildings, etc. They rely on the people in the industry to know the obligations. So let's say I want to buy like a case of wine, and I go online to get that done. I just want to get it done. Now, there are lots of different websites that I might try, And if I find one that's not accessible, or just even that it's just too hard to use, well, then I might find another one that does work, and chances are I'll place my order with that one and I'll never visit that first website again. And as long as I can get the job done, I'm not likely to take a lot of my time to go back to that first website and consider taking some kind of action against them because they were not accessible. So perhaps that commercial argument therefore does have some validity, since the website that's inaccessible or hard to use just lost some business. And if you think about disabled people like me, perhaps buying a few cases of wine a year, and it does kind of add up over time, I have to say, then you can see how that's going to add up to some lost income. But what if I want to buy something more specific, a particular product? Not just anything, but a particular product, a particular model of something that I want. And suppose you're in business and you've secured sole distributor rights to sell that product, so your website is the only one that has it, and I want to buy it, and I visit your website and it doesn't work for me. Now, if I get frustrated and I can't use your website because it's not accessible, and I can argue that it's not accessible, then there's a much higher chance that you'll be hearing from me. And if you don't resolve the problem, there is the chance you'll be hearing from my lawyer. You know, that's the way it is. That's the world we live in. Now, so there is a legal obligation. That's my point. It's not absolute. We know it's not absolute, and it never will be absolute, I think. Even with disability law, it will never be absolute. But it is there, and developers should be aware of it and make sure that you do the right thing for the client, because otherwise you land the client in it. Now, so, you know, that's just the nature of the way society is progressing. So now I want to turn a little bit to the how question. And here I want to make the point that nowadays, for a lot of everyday developments, you should be able to produce a good, accessible experience without it costing an arm and a leg. Now, I don't know how many people in the room here tonight are actual developers in the sense of, you know, people who actually sit at their computers and develop the websites or the apps that we all use. But I think you'll agree, those of you who know about this sort of thing, that nowadays we almost never sit down and actually write code from scratch. You know, if we're building a website, we don't start by just writing some HTML. We're almost certainly going to start with some kind of builder, some kind of website building tool, a content management system of some sort. Or if we're building an app, we're not going to start by just writing, you know, one line at a time of code for all of the controls that we're going to need. No, we're going to use tools to help us build that user interface, which is, after all, the essence of how the app will interact with the user. And in both those cases, the question of whether your app or your website will be accessible might simply boil down to which tools did you use. So here's an example of how the tools can make a difference. Last year, it was brought to my attention by somebody that a particular form on the Ministry of Social Development website was pretty much inaccessible and impossible for a blind person using a screen reader to complete. Now, beneficiaries were using this form it was one way to tell the government if you're going overseas for a holiday. And I recall when I looked at it, it was pretty bad. But it was really just, you know, 3 or 4 fields, you know, a date when you're departing and a date when you're coming back and why you're going. There wasn't much else. And it ought to have been very simple and straightforward. And I decided to share my frustration with the Director General of MSD, and he did actually reply. And he said, well, we can't do much about this straight away. It would have to wait until they replaced their content management system, something that they were planning to do in the near future. I think sometime this year. I haven't checked if there's been any change, but you never know. And I could have written a simple HTML form for just these 3 or 4 questions in just a few hours perhaps. But that clearly wasn't an option in this case. Maybe the form was inherently integrated into their CMS. So this illustrates that you can commit to a set of tools, and those tools are what lets you down, and there is little that you can do about it other than make the big decision to go to another set of tools, and that may not be a simple thing to do, but that may just be the option. But a different content management system or tool set might have produced a fully accessible outcome with no extra effort. Now, in my experience, for example, WordPress is an example of a CMS that strives to fully comply with accessibility guidelines. And I know that there are many other products where accessibility is one of the core deliverables. So I'm not saying, well, you just go and use one of those tools and forget about accessibility. Far from it. But what I am saying is that if you use the right content management system, then you should be able to focus on developing the website first from the core, and knowing that the core accessibility issues are going to be taken care of. Now then it will come down to the content, but of course as the developer you're not so worried about the content, you're developing the website. And in the same vein, Apple and Microsoft for Windows, they all have built-in features and accessibility guidelines. And if you, as a developer, were to just make your business to use those features and follow their guidelines, then the chances are that the things you develop will be reasonably accessible out of the box. But if you choose the wrong tool set, then your apps might be completely inaccessible, and there just might be nothing you can do because it's already part of the system you've used that makes it inaccessible. Now, it's often said that it costs a lot. It costs a lot to develop technology to be accessible. Well, I actually argue that in some ways the opposite is true. Because the irony is that if you sit down and write some straightforward HTML, even with a lot of CSS styling, or if you develop a simple app just by using the standard tools and the controls that your operating system provides, then your website or your app is likely to be accessible without you having to do much to think about it. That's because basically the technology does work. It's not, it's the things developers do after that. Now that's perhaps to create something that looks different, a particularly unique look and feel to stand apart from the crowd. That is what often makes things inaccessible. So it seems that disabled people sometimes take the rap for this, but dare I say it, it's more often that the problem is caused just by the vanity and the continuing desire to create exciting new ways of doing things that become inaccessible. But as I said, if you use the right tools and follow their recommended practices in everything that you do, then you can still produce good, unique looks and feels and content and structure for your website or your app. But it is likely to be accessible because you've followed those guidelines. So in summary, my point is that most of today's technology can be accessible if people just use those right tools and learn the right approaches from the beginning. Developers should understand the broad principles of accessibility, but shouldn't need to stress too much over the detail because that's going to be taken care of. But first be aware that your client is likely to have legal obligations and they may be relying on you as the developer to point those out. And you want to be sure that you don't land the client in hot water if the product is not accessible and ultimately someone does take the client on over that. Be aware that in that situation, the client could come after you for compensation as the developer. So it's no longer sufficient to just say, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't think of that. We'll try to deal with that again next time. And the second thing is, be aware of the different tool sets that are available. that can do much of the job for you, at least as far as the structure is concerned, so you don't need to worry about the detail. Avoid tool sets that don't deliver accessibility, and it won't be long before the vendors of those systems get the message. We rely on developers to stand up for that. Stick to the tool sets that do deliver accessibility, and that means that at least giving it some thought as the developer when you're thinking about, which content management system are you going to use, which library are you going to use for your control sets, etc. when you're developing. When you're making those decisions, if you can get accessibility right at that point, a lot of your work, a lot of your problems are going to be taken care of. Then all you've got to do is follow the recommendations of that package you've just got. So getting that right is going to make it easier for you and the client, and ultimately produce a much more accessible experience for end users, which is what it's all about. So thank you very much, everyone. That's my perspective as a developer.